They didn't raise their voices. They didn't issue a statement. They didn't even leak it to the press. But 5 minutes ago, something inside the royal machine shifted, and once it moved, there was no going back. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Here's the shocking question no one is asking out loud. What if Prince Harry's last attempt to regain control didn't fail because it was weak, but because it came too late? For years, we've been told this was a story about family drama, hurt feelings, interviews, memoirs. But that version is comfortable. This version isn't. Because according to multiple palace-adjacent sources, what just unfolded behind closed doors wasn't emotional at all. It was procedural, strategic, and final. Prince Harry, isolated and increasingly sidelined, believed he still had one lever left. One move powerful enough to force King Charles into a corner. Not through affection, not through reconciliation, through pressure. The kind of pressure that doesn't show up on camera, but makes institutions move. And here's the part that should make you sit up straight. Prince William saw it coming. Not last week. Not yesterday. Months ago. Imagine the scene. Phones vibrating quietly. Advisors exchanging looks without speaking. A decision made without drama. No shouting. No confrontation. Just a door closing, softly, deliberately. While someone is still on the other side. Why does this matter right now? Because timing is everything. King Charles is older. The monarchy is narrower. And William is no longer the heir in waiting. He is the operational center of gravity. While Harry was fighting the past, William was consolidating the present. And that's where the story turns dark. Harry's final move wasn't about attention. It wasn't about sympathy. It was about leverage. About forcing an outcome. About controlling a narrative so tight that King Charles would have no choice but to respond. Sources describe it as a gamble built on the assumption that the crown still feared exposure more than escalation. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if the palace had already decided that escalation was preferable to surrender? Think about that for a second. When does an institution stop negotiating and start neutralizing risk? Here's the contradiction that changes everything. The move Harry believed would protect him may have been the very thing that stripped him of protection altogether. Not publicly, quietly, legally, structurally. And Prince William didn't need to shout to make it happen. Ask yourself this. Who actually holds power in a monarchy? The one who speaks the loudest, or the one who controls access, legitimacy, and consequence? Because according to insiders, the word jail didn't surface as a threat. It surfaced as a boundary. A line drawn so clearly that crossing it would trigger processes no apology could undo. This wasn't about punishment. It was about containment. And as this decision settled into place, one truth became impossible to ignore. Prince Harry wasn't being challenged anymore. He was being managed. But what Prince Harry did next, and what Prince William quietly set into motion in response, would expose just how far this had already gone and why there was no exit strategy left. He thought he still had one move left. That's the detail most people miss. Because from the outside, Prince Harry's position looked weak. Fewer allies, fewer doors open, fewer invitations. But according to people who understand how royal power actually works, Harry wasn't acting out of desperation. He was acting out of belief. A belief that one final lever still existed. One that, if pulled hard enough, could force King Charles to bend. Here's the unsettling part. This wasn't an emotional play. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't an interview. It was something colder than that. For years, Harry had relied on visibility, cameras, public sympathy, narrative pressure. But this time, the strategy shifted. Sources describe it as a move rooted in procedure, not publicity. A calculation built on rules, not headlines. And that alone should tell you how serious it was. Imagine a chessboard where most pieces are already gone. No crowd watching. No clock ticking loudly. Just one player staring at the board, convinced the king is still exposed. Convinced the system will blink first. Harry's thinking was simple, according to insiders. If the institution still cared about avoiding internal conflict, then pressure applied at the right point could force a response. Not a conversation, a concession. And that assumption is where everything went wrong. Because while Harry was preparing this final move, Prince William wasn't reacting. He was preparing containment. William understood something Harry didn't. The monarchy had already passed the stage where it feared embarrassment more than instability. Let that sink in. There's a moment in every power struggle when the question stops being, how do we fix this? And becomes, how do we prevent this from happening again? According to multiple accounts, William believed that moment had already arrived. So when Harry's maneuver quietly surfaced inside palace channels, it didn't cause panic. It caused confirmation. Confirmation that Harry was no longer seeking resolution. He was seeking control. Ask yourself this. When does a family dispute stop being a family matter and start being a security concern? Harry's move, as described by sources, relied on proximity he no longer had. Access he assumed still existed. Protections he believed were automatic. But those assumptions were outdated. The system had shifted beneath his feet while he was still standing on old ground. And here's the cruel irony. The very mechanisms Harry tried to invoke were now overseen by people loyal to William's framework, not Harry's memory of the past. This wasn't 2018. This wasn't even 2020. The chain of authority had hardened. What Harry didn't anticipate was how quietly power can vanish. No announcement. No warning. Just silence where responses used to be. Delays where doors once opened. And behind that silence, decisions stacking on top of decisions. One advisor reportedly described it this way. Harry thought he was making a demand. The palace treated it as a risk assessment. And once something is labeled a risk, it stops being personal. That's when the language changed. Not publicly, internally. Words like leverage gave way to words like exposure. Control gave way to containment. And the most chilling shift of all, consequence stopped being hypothetical. Prince William didn't counter Harry's move directly. He didn't need to. He let the system do what it was designed to do when pressure crosses a line. And that's when the realization began to dawn. Harry wasn't negotiating anymore. He was testing boundaries that no longer moved. But the most dangerous part wasn't that his move failed. It was that it succeeded just enough to trigger something far worse. Because once Prince William saw exactly how far Harry was willing to go, he made a decision that would redefine what family meant inside the monarchy forever. And what happened next would close the door Harry never believed could be locked. Prince William didn't confront him. That's the part that feels almost unsettling when you understand how this really unfolded. No phone call. No dramatic warning. No last chance conversation. Because by the time Harry's move surfaced, William wasn't thinking like a brother anymore. He was thinking like a system. Here's the shock most people don't see coming. William never tried to stop Harry's move. He let it run just far enough to reveal its true shape. That's how you expose intent without escalating conflict. Inside the palace structure, William's response wasn't emotional. It was administrative. Quiet meetings. Legal language. Institutional boundaries being reviewed line by line. Not to punish, but to define limits so clearly that crossing them would trigger consequences automatically. This is where the story shifts from drama to power. William understood something critical. You don't defeat pressure by pushing back. You defeat it by removing the pressure point entirely. And according to insiders, that's exactly what he did. Ask yourself this. What happens when someone believes they still have leverage, but the system has already decided they don't? Harry's move relied on proximity to authority. The idea that King Charles could still be cornered into acting. But William had already positioned himself as the gatekeeper. Not publicly, functionally. Decisions flowed through him. Risk assessments landed on his desk. And once something landed there, it stopped being personal. This is where the word jail begins to surface, not as a threat, but as a framework. Because in institutional language, jail doesn't always mean bars and cells. Sometimes it means restriction, containment, removal of access, a narrowing of movement so precise that it feels invisible from the outside. And that's the contradiction that changes everything. Harry believed escalation would force engagement. William believed escalation required insulation. And those two beliefs collide very differently inside an institution built to survive centuries, not headlines. Short sentences start to matter here. No access. No intermediaries. No informal channels. Just process. One source described it as watching a door close in slow motion. Not slammed, not locked loudly, but sealed so completely that pushing on it only proves how solid it is. William didn't announce anything. He didn't leak anything. He simply allowed the system to recognize Harry's move as something it was designed to neutralize. Once that happened, Control shifted automatically. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When the palace stops responding emotionally, it means the decision has already been made. Harry's move didn't trigger outrage. It triggered paperwork. And paperwork is where power hides. Because once procedures are activated, no single person has to say no anymore. The answer becomes structural, inevitable, unappealable. Prince William understood this better than anyone. He wasn't shutting Harry down publicly. He was removing him from the equation entirely. And that's when the realization set in, not just for Harry, but for everyone watching closely. This wasn't a clash. It was a transition. From family conflict to managed risk. And once someone is classified as risk, the next step isn't debate. It's containment. But what that containment actually looked like, and why it was far more devastating than any public fallout, is where the story takes its most chilling turn yet. Because the moment the doors closed quietly, something irreversible happened behind them. It wasn't about putting him behind bars. That phrase keeps getting repeated for shock value, jail. But the reality, according to those familiar with how the palace operates, was far colder than that. Because what Prince William moved to activate wasn't punishment. It was exclusion. Here's the revelation that changes the meaning of everything you've heard so far. In royal terms, the most severe consequence isn't confinement. It's irrelevance. Once Harry's maneuver was formally categorized as risk, not rebellion, not disagreement, but risk. The response followed a path that had nothing to do with emotion. Systems don't argue. They narrow. They restrict. They quietly remove variables that create instability. And Harry became a variable. This is where the idea of jail becomes symbolic but devastatingly real. Because you can be free in the world and completely confined within an institution. No access to counsel through informal channels. No ability to apply pressure through proximity. No pathway back to influence. Just a shrinking perimeter around what you can touch, say, or affect. Short lines matter here. No leverage. No escalation. No reversal. From the outside, nothing looked different. No sirens. No headlines. But inside the structure, Harry's world had suddenly become very small. Ask yourself something uncomfortable. What's worse, being publicly punished or being quietly erased? William understood that spectacle would only feed the narrative Harry thrived on. Silence starves it. Procedure suffocates it. And according to multiple accounts, that's exactly why this response was chosen. Harry's final move was meant to force engagement. Instead, it triggered disengagement at the highest level. This is where the emotional weight lands. Because once you are no longer treated as a participant, nothing you do can change the outcome. You can speak. You can protest. You can escalate. But the system is no longer listening. It's already decided how to contain the fallout. One source put it bluntly, Harry wasn't being disciplined. He was being isolated from consequence-making power. That's the jail no one talks about. And here's the brutal irony. In attempting to control the monarch, Harry may have permanently forfeited any influence over the institution that surrounds him. The very act meant to force accountability instead confirmed the need for distance. Prince William didn't need to argue. He didn't need to convince anyone. The framework did the work for him. And King Charles? He was protected not by confrontation, but by insulation. This is why the move feels final. Not dramatic, but definitive. Because once boundaries are redrawn at this level, they aren't meant to be crossed again. Not by apologies. Not by interviews. Not by public sympathy. So when people ask whether Harry's final move failed, they're asking the wrong question. It worked, just not the way he expected. It revealed intent. It clarified threat. And it justified a response that required no further explanation. But the true consequence wasn't immediate. It unfolded quietly, over days and decisions, until one truth became impossible to ignore. Harry wasn't locked in. He was locked out. And what that means for his future, and for the monarchy moving forward, is where the story delivers its final, unsettling payoff. Because when you strip away the noise, the interviews, the speculation, what's left is a truth that's both quieter and more devastating than any headline. Prince Harry didn't lose a battle. He lost position. Remember the question we opened with. Who is the real threat to King Charles? For a long time, the answer felt obvious. Internal dissent, public criticism, a son willing to speak out. But what this episode reveals is something far more unsettling. The real danger was never the noise. It was the assumption that the crown could still be cornered. Prince William understood that assumption had to die. Not with confrontation, not with punishment, but with clarity. Because power doesn't need to announce itself when it's secure. It simply redraws the map. Harry's final move was built on the belief that escalation would force engagement. That pressure would produce reaction. That exposure would demand response. But the monarchy had already crossed a threshold. The point where engagement became optional. And once that happens, everything changes. Think about it. What do you do when someone keeps pushing a door that no longer opens? You stop pushing, or you exhaust yourself trying. That's the trap Harry walked into. By attempting to exert control, he confirmed the very concern that justified removing him from the equation. Not as revenge, as risk management. And that distinction matters, because risk doesn't get reconciled with, it gets contained. Prince William didn't win because he was louder. He won because he was quieter. He didn't frame Harry as an enemy. He framed the situation as unsustainable. And institutions respond to sustainability, not sentiment. This is the part that lingers. Because there's no dramatic reversal coming. No last-minute reconciliation forced by public pressure. No heroic return. The machinery that moved into place doesn't reverse itself for emotion.